sorry I can't be with you guys again, but I wanted to continue our series. We're continuing to look at discovering God in the wilderness. As the Israelites are traveling through the wilderness, how does God reveal himself to them? So I wanted to review with you guys really quick. I'm going to kind of flash where the Israelites have gone and where they have discovered God here up on the screen, because you'll remember they first realized that God was provider when they were wandering in the wilderness. When they set out right across the Red Sea, they needed food, and God provided for them. Next, they discovered God is victorious. When people came against them, remember we talked about God is our banner, and that they raised their hands. Moses raised his hands, and when his hands were raised, they were victorious, that they won the battle. After the battle, we realize that God is judge, that he sets up systems for judgment, and ultimately God is the one who decides. God is the one who judges us because he's perfect and he's just. He can judge completely fairly, and he has the right to do that. And moving from there, we hit Mount Sinai. And here's where we're going to be, because at Mount Sinai, we first realized two things. First, we realized that God is holy. Remember, the people were around Mount Sinai, and God is telling them, don't come up here. Don't even touch the mountain. Remember, you are human, and I am God. Remember your place. Remember, I am set apart. After that, the people realized that God is authority, that he gives the commandments, but the commandments mean nothing unless we see God as someone who has authority in our lives. And then last week, we looked at the idea of God redeems. Now remember, up to this point, the people had the general 10 commandments, but just like you and I do, when our parents tell us something, our gut reaction is to find a loophole. And the people were finding all sorts of loopholes with what God had given them in the 10 commandments. So God says, fine, let me flush this out for you. Let me fill in the blanks for you. And last week we looked at all of these little things, all these awkwardly specific examples that God flushes out for them about what it means for us to follow God. And he's looking at this, and we realize that part of following God is that we live in a fallen world. Things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. But what God is doing, God is saying, you are my people. And I'm setting apart a people. I'm setting apart a society. For those who say they want to follow me, here's how they are to do that. And he begins by fleshing out, saying, what does it look like for us to live in God's society? If we call ourselves Christian, what does that mean for us? How does that mean that we should live? Why is that important? So last week we looked at God redeeming some of those aspects of humanity and saying, I'm going to make those better. You being a Christian, you are to not go down this path, but to redeem them and point them back towards Christ. This week, we're going to continue that, but ultimately we realize as God is flushing all of this out, is saying, here's my commandments, and here's what they mean, and he's saying, here's specifically how they apply. We realize at the end of this verse, all this means nothing if we don't remember God. All of these things are just rules and regulations, but at the end God says, but really they're because you are to remember me. You are to have focus on me, and if you're focusing on me, then these things should happen. So open up your Bibles to Exodus chapter 22. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have you guys read verses 1 through 15. Have someone read, and then we're going to dive in and dissect this and realize, how does this apply to us? So the first idea that God is talking about is this idea of personal property. Now, obviously, most of us probably don't own many cattle. We don't own probably any donkeys. But back in those days, those things meant two things. First, cattle, livestock was money. It was how you traded. It was how you bought things. So if you took someone's or damaged someone's livestock, it'd be like me stealing money from you. That's what it was like back then. The second thing that did was also the amount of cattle, the amount of livestock you had was your place in society, was your social standing. It was your place of prosperity. So the more you had, the higher respect you had. So God is saying, if someone's to take that from someone, he's saying, how dare you? He's saying, we as individuals do not get to take from another person. We'll see now, granted, they didn't have the example of Jesus Christ, but we have the example of Jesus Christ. And we have a God who says, instead of self-taking instead of taking for yourself. Rather, he said, I'm self-giving. He gave himself for us. And this is what God is working up to. He says the society for him, he's saying it is important for us not to take, but rather how can we give? And he's saying people who are stealing like this, who are taking financially away from people, or taking in a sense that you're degrading someone, he's saying that's not how this society works. You are to give yourself so you can help those, so you can build others up. That's one of my rules in youth group. Respect. Not to tear people down, but to build them up. That comes from the 10 Commandments. And God is saying, if you're following me, if you want to be part of my family, if you want to be part of this society, you need to build others up and not take from them. Now, the next thing is he's talking about this protection of property. Now, this is interesting. It's a little balancing act that he's doing here, because we're told in the New Testament that we are to be good stewards of what we have. But here we're also saying we can defend what we have. Now, I want you guys to discuss a little bit, where's the balancing act? How do we be good stewards but not idolize or become materialistic? But then also at the same time, how do we protect what we have instead of letting everyone take advantage of us? What's the balancing act? Discuss that within your group. So here's the idea. God is saying you are to be a good steward of what you have, not to idolize it, but what you have given, what God has entrusted to you, he's saying take care of it. Whether that's, a Rolls Royce or if it's a Ford Taurus, he's saying take care of that car. Take care of that car so it runs, so you can use it as long as you need to have it run. And he's saying protect it as well. In verse 2, God lays out a very specific example. He's saying if a thief is stealing from someone, that's what thieves do, and is killed in the process, the owner is not responsible for that because the thief is in the wrong. This seems pretty obvious, but here in America, it seems that thieves are almost more protected than the owners. If you're a farmer, you have to have field insurance, property insurance. Why? Because if someone's on your land, if they're hunting on their land, if they're just trespassing on your land and they hurt themselves, they can turn around and sue you. Now, it's not their land. They might not have even supposed to have been there. They could have been even doing something illegal, but if they got hurt, they can turn around and sue you. How drastically different is that than from what God said? If we are trespassing, if we are somewhere where we're not supposed to be, it's our fault, and if we get harmed, that's on us. Why do you guys think, now discuss this with your group, why do you think that society has now almost started protecting the person who is in the wrong opposed to the owner? Discuss how we've got there. God concludes this by saying we are to be responsible and fair and just as believers. Look in verses 3 through 16. If we're borrowing something, if we're entrusted with something, God says we are to be responsible with that. Now, this is so different than maybe what society says. Society says, if someone's given you something or entrusted you with something, and you either lose it or break it or damage it, our initial response is to blame someone else or to push it off or to hide it. But God says if that is happening, you as a believer need to take ownership of that. The idea of responsibility recycles again. And God is saying, as a believer, as a follower of God, you are to take responsibility. So I challenge you guys. Responsibility is one of those hard things to do, where it's so easy for us to try to find a way out. That's what the Israelites are doing. That's why God has painstakingly taken 3 chapters in Exodus and flushed out these specific incidences because people don't want to take responsibility. So I challenge you guys to be a person who is responsible, who owns up to what they have done and is able to be responsible for what they're entrusted with, because that is what God calls us to. Concluding this thought and continuing it, God now in verses 16 through 27, God is talking about our personal integrity. So we've moved on from when things happen to other people, when things are stolen, and now God is saying, what are you held accountable? What should our integrity be? And God brings in three things. And the first thing he brings in is to care for others. Again, full circle, fast forward to what God demonstrates his love to us by sending his son. He's talking about caring for the other person. So often it's about what is comfortable for us. What do we want to do? I think about almost any task. I think I'll use our mission trip 2 summers ago as an example. It's during our mission trip, you're working with kids, and after each day, you're kind of tired. But we would have to make meals. We'd have to clean up. We'd have to do some service projects. And frankly, you wouldn't feel like doing it. And sometimes certain people would push those responsibilities off to other people. But what God is saying, he's saying, care for those around you. Whether it's someone who has the same ability as you still want to care for them. Or more specifically, what God is talking about is those who are less than you, whether less in their capability. He's talking about widows and orphans, those people who aren't physically able to provide for themselves. But maybe for you, it's sticking up for someone at school who, popularity-wise, isn't able to defend themselves. What he's saying is care for those people who other people take advantage of. Care for those who are being taken advantage of. He's saying no Christian, no follower of God will let someone else be taken advantage of. There's this idea of love. Christ coming down and offering himself for us. Do not let others be taken advantage of. Next, God brings in 3 things that society wants to infiltrate us with. He talks about sorcery, bestiality, and idolatry. Now those are 3 weird words. One of them is like way out there, but they existed back then and they still exist today. This idea of sorcery, practicing magic, practicing the dark arts, if you will. Now that looked very obvious back then, where you would actually have magicians. You would actually have people who would define themselves as sorcerers. Today it looks a lot different, but it's still very prevalent. There's a constant battle of what counts as magic. And I've had this discussion with some of you, but there are things as much as Harry Potter. As how much Harry Potter has influenced society, so much of Harry Potter is magic. And calling upon anything else for power or provision aside from God can be classified as magic. So there's a fine line of what is just fictional opposed to what is infiltrating, what is inspiring our society. Is that focusing on God, or is that focusing on, well, what is something else that we can use to get what we want? Then he talks about this idea of bestiality. And that's the idea of having sex with animals, which is completely disgusting, and I get that. But it existed back then, and unfortunately it still exists today. Now, legally, it's not permissible. You'll get arrested for animal cruelty and a whole bunch of other things. But there's this idea that God is calling us to a higher sex standard. Now, most of us probably don't have an urge to go sleep with an animal, but what God is saying, there are sexual fulfillments that people are venturing out and trying, and he's saying you aren't to do that. God is saying, I have defined marriage, and you are to keep to that. You are to hold to the sexuality that God has created. And finally, this idea of idolatry. He's saying you are to have no other idols for me. Remember, that was God's big thing in the 2 chapters before this. God is saying you are to worship me and me alone. Now, back then, they had physical images of other gods that they worshiped that were idols. Today, we have things called TV. We have things called sports. We have things called school. We have things called popularity. We have things called work, money, whatever, that aren't necessarily physical things that we're putting up in a shrine, but they're things that we chase after with our lives. And God is saying, don't do that. He's saying it's not only toxic to us, but he's saying it's actually toxic to the society that he is setting up, which brings it to a bigger picture. Now, finally, God concludes with a big picture that I want you guys to take away with. Look with me in verses 28 through 31. Here's God's takeaway after he's given us the 10 Commandments, after he spent 2 very long, very tedious chapters explaining very specific things to do and not to do. He ends with this. Check this out. God says, with all these rules, with all these guidelines, he's saying do them, not just to do them, but rather do them in remembering me, to worship me. Worship is defined as an homage or a gratitude towards someone. And what homage means is picture back in the medieval times, it was like a low servant recognizing that he was a servant to his master and serving him gracefully. So what homage is being able to us come before God saying, God, you are in charge, I am your servant. And saying, you are elevated, you are on high. That's what worship is. God is saying, if you are worshiping me like I deserve to be worshipped, all these things shouldn't even be an issue. Shouldn't be an issue, but it's because we find loopholes. It's because we want to sin, because sin entices us, that we find these loopholes in God's creation that we want to say, well, God, you never specifically said that looking at this was sin. God, you never specifically mentioned some of these things in the Bible, so they might not be right. God, you never had a computer, so these things must be like neutral because you didn't have a computer and you never talked about them. No, God is saying if it's taking worship away from me, it's sin. Next he says, do not revile me. This word revile, that's kind of a weird word, but the word revile means to despise or to come before God in a disrespectful manner. God is saying, don't come before me. And he's not talking at church, guys. Back then he was saying, when you come to the tabernacle. But here's the thing, God is everywhere. God's at school, God's at home, God's with your friends. He's everywhere. So he's not talking just about church. So he's saying, wherever you are, if you're coming before me, if you're acting, if you're talking before me in a reviling way, disrespectful to me, he's saying, don't do that. That kills the society that God's coming into, and it's killing you. And he ends with this, he's ending with God needs to be our first. And he's saying every firstborn, it should be dedicated to him or sacrificed to him. If it was an animal, it was sacrificed. If it was a child, it was dedicated. Now, obviously, today we have child dedication, but that's not the same as what God was talking about. What God's talking about, he's saying all these rules, all these guidelines that he's having to put in because of our sin nature. He ends with, hey, everything that we do, he's saying none of this is going to be an issue for you. If he's saying if we're putting God first, if in everything we do we remember God, if when we're at school, if we remember God, we won't be tempted by peer pressure. If we're at home, if we're remembering God, it'll be a lot easier to have a family dynamic. If we're remembering God when we're watching TV, movies, reading books, listening to things, it will be a lot easier to say no to the garbage that's out there. God kind of ends with this last rule. He's saying, if you remember me, whatever you're doing, if you can equate that with me, if you can remember me, if those two things can be brought together, he's saying you're doing all right. But if he's saying what you're watching, what you're listening to, what you're doing, what you're saying, how you're acting, and remembering me are on two different planets, he's saying that's an issue. That's an issue. So my challenge for you guys this week, and to remember that God is to be remembered in all that you say, all that you do, all that you are. God is to be remembered. Who is God in your personal life? Who is God in your friend life? Who is God at your school life? Who is God in your sports life, friend life, extracurricular life? Who is God? Or does God change from the moment you walk into church, and then does he change the moment you walk out? Because if that's the case, then he has all these rules for you. But if he's saying if God's the same here as he is in every aspect of your life, and you're remembering God, he's saying these things shouldn't even be an issue for you. So that's my challenge for you guys today. I hope you guys have a great week. I am in school, so you guys can be praying for me. You guys think going to school from 8:30 to 3 is bad. I'm in school from 8 to 6 o'clock Monday through Saturday. So if you guys want to pray for me, that would be awesome. But know that I'm praying for you while I am trying to stay awake during class. So we'll talk to you guys later, and I'll see you guys. I miss you. Bye.